Well, good afternoon, and welcome to part 3 of our 6-part series looking at the United States Constitution, past, present, as well as projecting onwards into the future. And we were talking when we were together on Tuesday, looking here in terms of the formal end of the American Revolutionary War. And from the standpoint of the 13 colonies, the question then became one of what now, or what next, in essence. And in this regard, they knew that they had these Articles of Confederation, they had the Continental Congress that was thrown together haphazardly all the way back in 1775. It was more of a focus here of prevailing, emerging successful or victorious in this American Revolutionary War. Well, the Americans are going to do just that, and now they realize that these 13 colonies, some of them are very large, the majority of them are very, very small in terms of population, that they need some sort of centralized government. Because really what was happening here is that for this new nation, formally minted in July 4th, 1776 officially, what you have here is in essence 13 independent countries almost. And they see each other as rivals in the vast majority of cases, or at least they look at one another with a good deal of suspicion. This is particularly true of the 10 small states looking here at the larger 3 states. So there had to be some way, in essence, to bridge this gap and to get this nation formally here in its embryonic stage off on the right foot, if that were at all possible. Well, the delegates will descend here in May of 1787 from the 13 colonies. All of the 13 colonies are going to send representatives to Philadelphia here in May of 1787, with the exception of Rhode Island. Rhode Island here is a small population entity. As far as they're concerned, what could come out of this is going to be nothing more than a way for the larger nations, or I should say rather the larger states, to take advantage here of the smaller states. There was also, as we referenced too in our presentation on Tuesday, a good deal of fear on the part of the Founding Fathers that you may end up here with something of an individual who is a king in everything but name. That would also be a disaster as far as the delegates were concerned, whether they were from a large state or a small state. Well, it is sent formally on Constitution Hall here in 1787, and we referenced here in the opening salvo on Tuesday, in terms of the convention itself, there were a total of 55 delegates present here on this first day. The majority of them would remain on through the summer and into September before all of this would be formally ironed out. But by the time all is said and done in September, only 41 of them were still there. Well, here what you have is a case of trying to move forward, trying to in fact formally sort out the best path possible. And what is imperative to understand furthermore is that for this nation, the United States, they have 2 major influences. The first major influence here was Britain and the British form of government. With this monarchy, obviously they're very, very well aware of the monarchy, but you also had here a legislative assembly there, a parliament, with a lower house, the House of Commons, and upper house, the House of Lords. So this is something here, judicial levels here as well across the island nation of Britain. And it's something that for the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, they're very, very well aware of that. And as far as they're concerned, there's strengths to that aspect. There's also things that we're not going to have any interest in. Second of all, the nation of France. And we spent a good deal of time looking at Britain and France and Britain and its rivalry in part 1 of our 6-part series last week. And the reason being here is that the French are going to have an enormous influence on the Founding Fathers. And this whole concept here of going back to Rousseau and his social contract, if you have a monarchy that is unjust, wherever it may be in the world, it is a responsibility here of the citizenry to rise up and throw off this yoke of oppression. Well, it fits in well with Thomas Jefferson, who is a child of the Enlightenment, no doubt about that, so too John Adams. Ben Franklin is heavily influenced by this as well. The list is endless of the Founding Fathers. You have here an overwhelmingly positive view of France. They are Francophiles through and through, because here you have the excuse to get rid of British monarchical rule on the eastern seaboard of North America. Well, we introduced also on Tuesday James Madison. And James Madison is given the title. He is given the title here of Father of the U.S. Constitution. This living, breathing document, the oldest constitution in the entire planet, up to and including the present day. What you have here is an individual who is going to do his homework. He's going to be giving a lot of speeches as well, as we'll be talking about on the floor here of Constitution Hall in 1787. But he is going to be looking here first and foremost at this birthplace of democracy, ancient Greece, in particular the city-state of Athens. A prominent civilization from 800 to 338 before Common Era, and in this regard, it's a primitive democracy, no doubt about that. This rule of the people, as James Madison will stress time and time again. But you also have a revolving door that you could, in fact, you're not going to be on any one of these two major entities in Greek democracy back in ancient history, the magistrates or the council, because you can only serve on it, you can only serve here on this for a one-year term. You cannot serve 2 consecutive terms. So when you go back here and you decide, because any citizen can participate here in the assembly, as we reference what it meant to be a citizen in ancient Greece, you had to be male, you had to be a landowner. So only 25% of the population in ancient Athens could actually participate in this process, but it's pretty amazing or impressive, all things considered, considering how many thousands of years ago it was. But your names here are drawn by lot to be on the magistrate or the council. And if you are on here either organization, you serve for 1 year and then you step down. And the following year, let's say your name's drawn out of that hat again to serve either as a magistrate or a councilman, you have to decline. You have to decline because there was a concern about somebody having too much power and a demagogue formally emerging here in ancient Greece. Well, he'd also look not just at ancient Greece, but also Switzerland. Also Switzerland. And in this regard, he found Switzerland having a great deal of commonality with this new nation, the United States. Switzerland was very small, just like the United States. Remember, the population of the U.S., it's projected to be by 1800 only 5 million people. It's very, very small, even by the standards here of this time period. At the time of 1776, you have just under 3 million people living in this nation at the time of the Declaration of Independence. Well, with Switzerland, there was this resistance to oppression. They were always able to remain neutral, to steer clear here of foreign policy of other nations, the larger, more prominent nations, especially Britain and France. Sidestepped this time and time again, and they were able to preserve for literally generations here this neutral stance. They had a people's militia, they had a government known from a standpoint of federalism, and as far here as James Madison was concerned, there was no sort of monarchical rule in Switzerland either. And this would be something that could also work, more of a present-day perspective here, or present day by the standpoint of 1787 for James Madison. Well, what you have is he comes forth with his Virginia plan, this Virginia plan. And with the Virginia plan in a step-by-step process, here, what you're looking at here is more of a case of an overview. Remember, we have those 3 large states, Virginia, as well as Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. And the other 10 states here are leery that these 3 states who control more than half the population of this new nation, the United States, they're going to be pretty much ruling the roost. Well, here you have an individual, James Madison, who is going to put forth this Virginia plan. And first and foremost, he's going to state the obvious. You have this need here in this new nation, the United States, here in the year 1787, a need for a strong central government. We do not have that. We have state governments all up and down the eastern seaboard here, no problem whatsoever. But we need to have a focus. We need to have a strong centralized government. Second of all, this central government, or this central authority, this federal government needs to be superior. It needs to be superior to all 13 states. No other way around this. Third, as a way of further enforcing this, we need a federal court system. A federal court system. And he would point out here, James Madison, he would point out that in terms of federal courts, you have this is very, very prominent, especially in the island nation of Britain. And it worked quite well. You have various layers. We need various layers here as well. It's something here that we could take from the British. It would work no problem. Fourth, representation. Representation should be based primarily in this new federal government, in this new centralized government, based by population. Well, that's one for the home team as far as the smaller states are concerned, because he's a Virginian. He's from one of the big states. From here, one of the big states. So representation needs to be based by population. So in other words, yes, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, with all due respect to the other 10 states, we matter more. We matter more. We carry here the greatest amount of clout in this new nation, the United States. And fifth and final, we're going to have a parliamentary assembly of sorts, what we can refer to here as Congress. And Congress has to have the authority to bypass states. So for example, if the state of South Carolina and the state of Virginia do not like something here that is being decided by this new central federalized government, if they don't like it, well, in that situation, too bad. Too bad, because the federal government is the ultimate authority, in particular here Congress, in terms of domestic policy and the way forward here across the board. James Madison was a very, very strong nationalist. By the same end here, the delegates from Virginia, his home state, as well as Pennsylvania also supported here his plan. It's kind of like a rough foundation, a rough sketching out, so to speak. But by the same end here, they believe, many of the delegates, especially from Pennsylvania and Virginia, that what's also needed is a strong system of checks and balances. Because you don't want the courts becoming stronger here than the legislative entity or Congress. You want this to be set up that each side has power over the other entity and the other entity has power over it. Okay? That neither or none of these entities or these divisions, whether it's the courts or a legislative assembly, becomes too powerful. It is something here that needs to be avoided, and avoided like the plague. Well, in this case, at the same time that the Virginia plan is formally put forth, you're going to have a delegate here from South Carolina, Charles Pinckney. Charles Pinckney, who lived from 1727 to 1824, he would put forth what became known here as the Pinckney Plan. The Pinckney Plan. Well, for Charles Pinckney, because remember, this is more of this blank slate that the Founding Fathers are dealing with. They've got an idea as to how things would look, but they're not exactly sure how it could all be ironed out, and you need here majority rules to get this off the ground. You also want to keep whatever comes forth. You want to keep this flexible enough so that everything isn't etched in stone and it becomes this rock that's completely immobile as the decades, in fact, formally pass. Well, the Pinckney Plan. The Pinckney Plan here, coming forward from this delegate of one of the smaller states, South Carolina. Charles Pinckney stressed the following. Number one, we have to have a very strong central government. Okay? Well, he agrees there with James Madison, no doubt about that. Number two, we have to have a bicameral legislature. So yeah, we'll have a House of Parliament or Legislative Assembly of Congress, whatever we're going to end up calling it, that's fine. But there should be two houses. There should be a lower house, a House of Delegates here also, or a House of Representatives, as he also describes it as. And the House of Delegates here, or the House of Representatives, they would be popularly elected. Popularly elected. And then from this House of Delegates, those who are on the floor here in this lower house, what they would do is then they would vote from amongst themselves members to sit in the Senate. Okay? This would be here the creme de la creme. You're going to go to the upper house. You're going to go here, in fact, to the upper house, the more important house. And Pinckney would stress that in this regard, we're comparable to Britain, because Britain has a House of Parliament. They got the House of Commons, the lower house. The lower house. They have the House of Lords. The House of Lords, the upper house. And the House of Lords was the landed aristocracy, the creme de la creme. Now, they're not voted on by the House of Commons. It's more of a case if your father was a member of the House of Lords and you are his eldest son, you are going to inherit that title. But it would be a way here far more prominent to be a member of this U.S. Senate as opposed to being a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Well, in this case, what terms, how they'd be ironed out, etc., wasn't exactly clear, but you had to run for election for the House of Delegates. The Senate you would not. And you would have here the national legislature. The national legislature here is going to overpower, it's going to be the authority of the land. It is going to oversee all the states, they're all subservient, all 13 of them, no exceptions. But also here, you would look towards bringing forth a chief executive or president, to basically oversee all of this, to oversee this new strong federal government or centralized government. The chief executive would also need to have veto power over legislation that comes forth from this bicameral legislation, from a House of Representatives as well as a U.S. Senate. Well, here, it's a proposal, it's a plan, and as far as many of the delegates are concerned, they're listening here to James Madison. They're listening as well to this Pinckney plan that was put forth literally the same day as James Madison finished up his overview as to what he envisioned for this federal government. And many of the smaller states begin to protest. And they begin to protest because, as far as they were concerned, we're not here in Philadelphia to establish a new government. What we're here in Philadelphia to do is to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. We're not out here to reinvent the wheel by any means. That wasn't our understanding here for coming to Philadelphia this summer. Well, what this represents is a bit of a rift, once again, between the delegates in terms of understanding and how to move forward. They also realized here on May 30th, 1787, that they would vote on formally scrapping the Articles of Confederation or still keeping them as a possibility. Well, majority rules here. Of these 55 delegates, the Articles of Confederation are officially scrapped. Now it's time to work on plans that came forth from James Madison and or Charles Pinckney, if at all possible. Well, the goal now becomes exclusively to develop here a new government, a federal government, and to move forward from there. Well, what the decision is made here, is to have three distinct branches or three distinct entities that will be put in the Constitution. And what you want to do when you're in this situation, you have a lot of people here who are leery of other delegates, etc., leery of other states in particular. Some of them already have a great deal of hostility. The northern states have a pretty patronizing attitude towards the southern states and the southern delegates, and the feeling is also, in fact, formally mutual. A lot of that is because of the issue of slavery at this time. But what you have here is a sense with the federal government. James Madison, with his Virginia plan, what he recommended is, let's start, if we're going to try and develop here three distinct branches and a system of checks and balances, a sharing of power, so to speak, let's do the easy part first. And the easy part first will be to start with this legislative branch. I have referenced this as well. My fellow founding father here, Charles Pinckney, put forth a very good idea, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of a two-house legislature, a lower house as well as an upper house. The upper house, the Senate, would be more prominent than the House of Delegates or House of Representatives. That makes a good deal of sense. But what you have here, is a sense of moving forward. Let's start with the legislative branch because it'll be the easiest. Well, the delegates therefore turned first and foremost to this Virginia plan, with also potentially part of the Pinckney plan tied in with it. And here what you have is that Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, no surprise at all, they were all on board that the way we set up this legislative branch or Congress is that it's based on population. Well, they are the three dominant states in terms of population, and the 10 smaller states, as far as they're concerned, that's not going to happen. That is not going to happen, because if that's the situation here, we're going to be nothing more than pawns for the larger states. Well, here, what the smaller states were proposing, is let's do the same thing we did with the Continental Congress as well. Here's the Articles of Confederation. One state, one vote. We got 13 states here. We're going to have 13 votes. Well, as far as Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts were concerned, that's not going to happen. That's not fair, not in any way, shape, or form. We're over 50% of the population here of the United States. So you're at this first bump in the road. Well, what you have coming forth from these individuals here in 1787 at Philadelphia was this tremendous ability to compromise. Life is an eternal compromise, okay? And in this situation here, for these delegates, they realize they've got to work out some sort of plan that would benefit both sides, and we can move beyond this. And what they decide here, they're looking at a British model for a lower house and an upper house, like the British had the House of Commons, the upper house was the House of Lords. They're looking here for a House of Representatives, the lower house, and an upper house here, the Senate. How to work this through in terms of representation, that became one of the major challenges. Well, Connecticut here is going to come up with a compromise. Delegates from the state of Connecticut will come up with a compromise that they think should work for both states, or all states. And what you have here is a situation that indeed Connecticut stresses here that we all recognize the larger states deserve a good deal of influence, perhaps more influence than all of us smaller states. We get that. We understand that. If we were a member of the Pennsylvania delegation or Massachusetts, or we were a member here of the Virginia delegation, we'd feel the same way, pulling for the home team. However, how about this? This lower house, this House of Representatives or House of Delegates in this legislative assembly that we're talking about, the lower house, that's going to be based on population. And the way we're seeing this in terms of overall population is we're looking at a House of Representatives that's going to have a total of 65 members. 65 members in this House. So in this case, Pennsylvania, you're going to receive more delegates than Connecticut's going to. No doubt about that. Virginia, you're getting more delegates than Georgia. Everybody is going to be represented. We'll all get here, and there's at least one representative for this House of Representatives. But by the same end here, we have to have it a situation that the larger states are also viewed in a prominent light. They deserve more seats. But the upper house, the Senate, in this regard, what we need to do, which is far more important, far more prestigious, every single state gets 2 senators. Every single state. Pennsylvania, you're getting 2 senators. Rhode Island, they're not even here at the convention. Rhode Island is also going to get 2 senators. They may only get 1 member of the House of Representatives. But in this regard here, it's more important, but now we're equal. Now we're equal for the final stage of legislation that's going to go forth. The Connecticut Compromise, as far as the large states are concerned, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. As far as the 10 smaller states are concerned, that makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. No problem. No problem whatsoever. So the situation here is that the first major hurdle of these 3 branches of government, the legislative branch, it's off and running. It's off and running. The question became one of, well, what do we do? We're going to have the members of the House of Representatives. They're going to be elected by the popular vote. To be here, able to vote at this time in the United States, you had to be male, you had to be a landowner. And in this sense, you're going to have here, it's a very, very large enfranchisement, in fairness, compared to especially most nations in Europe at this stage. So you're going to be here electing members to sit in the House of Representatives, but then what do we do with the Senate? What do we do with the Senate? Do we have that elected then from the House of Representatives to go up by state delegates, et cetera? That became a question. It was something we could iron out later. Regardless of how they're appointed or if they're going to be elected as well, they're all going to get 2. We're all getting 2. We all agree on that. Perfect. They can move on. Well, the issue here, the final issue to sort through when you have this population part of it is slavery. And the slave population. Now remember, slaves make up 25% of the population here of the United States at this time. And as far as Southerners are concerned, they are not humans. They are basically here property. They are a property that's off the table. We're not talking about this in any way, shape, or form. There'll be a number of northern delegates who have a great deal of hostility to this institution. They see the South as a grave embarrassment here in 1787. An institution that is not sustainable, needs to be done away with. That comes forth later on as the summer of 1787 progresses. But from the standpoint of the issue of slavery, the issue of slavery is that the southern states will stress they are not citizens, they have no rights, they're property. They are property. And 5 to 7% here of southern landowners, are slave owners. So not the vast majority, not by any stretch of the imagination, but for these individuals who own slaves, they had very, very large slave populations. Well, in this case, as far as the northern states are concerned, well, then slaves aren't counted. As far as the southern states are concerned, no, they should be counted. Well, you just said they're property, they're not human beings. That doesn't matter. They are still here part of our estate, part of our respective states. And in this situation, for representation, the slaves need to be counted. Well, the northern states, who basically have no interest in slavery, and not because they were more enlightened by any stretch of the imagination, just because there was no real need for slavery, in states like Pennsylvania and New York here at this stage, and Connecticut and Massachusetts, etc. As far as the northern states are concerned, you can't have your cake and eat it too. It came time for another compromise, therefore, to iron this out. And at this time, what the compromise is made is that slaves can be counted as individuals, as a person, but only 3/5. So every slave you have, that is 3/5 of a vote, to add here to your numbers in the seats of the House of Representatives. And with this 3/5 compromise rule for North and South, what we're going to end up with, and they can already see the writing on the wall by early June of 1787, is you're going to end up with this lower house here on the legislative branch, a lower house that is going to have, in terms of the northern states, 35 representatives from the northern states, 30 representatives from the southern states, okay, for a total of 65. We all know there's going to be a total of 26 senators when all is said and done, if everything gets off the ground, because you've got 13 states, 2 senators across the board, hence that will be the reality. So it appears as though here, as the early summer formally begins in 1787 in Philadelphia, that with this legislative branch, it's in pretty good shape. James Madison is very pleased. He's very pleased because he believed this would be the easiest of the 3 branches. Now it was time to move on to the executive branch. To the executive branch, which would be, in fact, a bit more challenging. A bit more challenging. But what you witness here in the Constitutional Convention is the importance of compromise. And we see it through and through with the establishment of this legislative branch. What do we do with the populations? How do we make this fair? How do we make this attractive for all 13 states, preferably, or at least the majority, because 9 of the 13 states have to ratify this Constitution to make it official. They can move on to the executive branch. Well, for the executive branch, you have here an individual. You have here an individual who is going to speak first, and that will be, once again, James Madison. But the problem for James Madison was setting up the executive branch. He was leery about any one single individual, a chief executive or a president, as the phrase is already being used, who is going to have too much power. He'll have, in fact, here too much power. And there's really no precedent from Madison's standpoint, because his whole focal point is ancient Greece. There were no chief executives there. There's a fear of a demagogue, in fact, quite frankly, in ancient Greece. So you steered completely and utterly clear from that. By the same end, Switzerland didn't have any sort of chief executive here in the late 1700s. There was more of a case of symbolism for loud voices or significant voices here in Switzerland. But no single person would have too much power. And by the same end, adding to that point, 3 for Madison is you can't have anything like a king. Because otherwise, what was the point of this revolution? What is the point of all of this? We're not going to have another George III who could become something of a George III or his successors in time, and we'd be right back to square one. And this experiment that we have here for this federal republic would be for naught. Well, James Wilson James Wilson is going to step in. And from James Wilson's perspective, from his standpoint, he believed firmly that you need a strong executive. You need here a strong executive, and that this individual, Wilson stressed, this individual had to have the ability to make or declare war. Make or declare war. By the same end, this individual should also be given a relatively free hand in foreign policy. In foreign policy, that's more or less his turf. Domestic policy, James Wilson stressed, this Virginia delegate, domestic policy is the turf of Congress. This House of Representatives, this Senate. As far as foreign policy, the executive branch should have a fair amount of freedom to conduct foreign policy as that chief executive would see fit. Well, as far as many delegates were concerned, this was an issue, and it was an issue because in terms of it came down to declaring war, Congress should have that ability. Because otherwise you could have somebody who's just going to decide to start declaring war all over the place, and there's no implications, no ramifications for doing that. So in this regard here, as a compromise, to start talking in terms of only Congress can declare war. Only Congress can declare war. It's part of the system of checks and balances. But the chief executive here, as far as James Wilson is concerned, foreign policy is more or less his gig, his turf here at this time. Because we have to empower this individual. Because if we don't empower this individual, he's going to become nothing but a pawn of Congress. And if we give him too much power, he's going to become an autocrat. He's going to become a demagogue. And he had the potential then of destroying here this democratic experiment. Well, with James Wilson, he is looking therefore for a national executive who has power over Congress, but is also here answerable to Congress. And in this sense, he also has to be sure, and he is stressing this to the delegates in Philadelphia, that whoever this president becomes, he cannot be given so much power or trample over the rights of the other two branches to the stage that we're going to end up with this demagogue. We're going to end up with an individual who would threaten the republic itself. So it's a bit of walking here in a minefield, a bit of trying to walk down the middle of the road. You want a chief executive who's strong, but not too strong. Not too strong. Because he would stress as well, James Wilson, going back to the Magna Carta in 1215 in historic Britain, stressed here to King John, and for all the monarchies that followed, no one, whether king, queen, whoever, no one is above the law. And it has to be the same thing here. Well, this becomes a challenge. It becomes here a major challenge, no doubt about it. But as far as the Founding Fathers were concerned, here as the summer of 1787 progresses, we can iron this out. We can iron it out, no problem. Not a question of if here, it's a question of when. But the bigger issue here for these individuals, is that do we appoint a president or do we elect a president, or how should we do this? How should this be in fact formally established? Well, the decision is made is that if we're calling ourselves a parliamentary democracy, which is what we're going to be here as a strong federal government, we should allow for the people themselves to formally elect the president. We shouldn't be appointed by Congress. If he's appointed by Congress, he's going to be answerable almost exclusively to Congress. So in this sense here, we should have this set up, we should have this established of a popular vote across all 13 states in our nation, the United States. A popular vote. Well, that's fine on paper, but the Founding Fathers here, who are also very well educated, they're all overwhelmingly very, very wealthy. As far as they're concerned, they look at the average person who's going to be electing here this chief executive, and they see them as completely ignorant. Is that a lofty attitude to have? Yeah, no doubt about it. They don't care. So the concern here is, what if you have these people who are going to be allowed to vote in our democracy, the others? what if they get together and decide, oh, this is the person who's best and is the worst fit imaginable? This person could be corrupt as hell, etc. It'd be a disaster. And it's going to hurt all of us here, us delegates, or our children or grandchildren at some point in the early 19th century. Well, the decision is made here, and it's brought up again as a compromise, that yes, let's have an open election. But we'll also introduce, as an insurance policy, the Electoral College. The Electoral College. Now, with the Electoral College here, it's an insurance policy as far as the fathers are concerned, that you can basically make sure you get the right person in this chief executive position. So when Americans are going to be going to the polling booths here, as they're talking about the executive branch now, as the Americans are going to the polling booth, what you're doing here is you're voting, yes, it looks like you're voting for that person, person A or person B, but what you're really doing is you're voting for delegates from your respective state who are completely tied to either candidate A or candidate B. And in this sense, the election, which will be held every 4 years, is not going to be over. It is not going to be officially over here until you have a situation that the Electoral College has voted, has formally confirmed this. Well, the problem, which was also brought up here on the floor of Philadelphia in 1787, is that, well, what this could mean here is that with majority rules, we're calling ourselves a democracy, and you can have a person who doesn't receive the most votes, candidate A, finishes second to candidate B, but candidate A still wins the election because they won the Electoral College. That's not democratic. Well, let's hope that doesn't happen, would be the attitude on the part here of the Founding Fathers. And of course, it's happened 4 times, okay? 2 times in our lifetime. To which it's a sense of how can you call yourself a democracy when the person who wins the most votes does not get to be president? I don't want to make this a Democrat or Republican thing, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't make a lot of sense. This decision was made in fairness by the Founding Fathers because they had no respect for your average American, this average American male who's going to be going to the voting booth, to make the right choice. So you've got to put up Plan B to make sure you get the right person in there. The Electoral College. Well, another compromise, and as far as these delegates are concerned, it sounds workable. It sounds doable. We have here a backup plan, a Plan B. As the convention continued, the last thing for them to work through was the judicial branch. So we've got not perfected the legislative branch. We've got here a skeletal framework, a foundation as to how it's going to go. By the same token, we have an executive branch. What this chief lieutenant, chief executive, or president, whatever you're going to call him, George Washington here is known, remember, as the president of the Constitutional Convention. He's saying very, very little. He was very, he's a charismatic figure, kind of like let the forces roll here as they may, said very little throughout the entire summer of 1787. In this situation, next and final, after you have pretty much set the executive branch, you're going to have this person popularly elected, which is a gamble, but if you have that Electoral College, it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to be an issue. The judicial branch. Now, here's the problem with the judicial branch. The judicial branch, what the American delegates here in Philadelphia, this summer of 1787, when they thought in terms of judicial branches, basically, not so much state courts across here the respective 13 states, or what before that had been the 13 colonies, that were obviously heavily British influenced. What they're concerned with here is that in Britain, in the 1700s, British judges were overwhelmingly tied to the English crown. They're overwhelmingly tied here to the House of Lords, to the landed aristocrats, the gentry. And in this case here, they're going to overwhelmingly be siding with the landed classes. And this is something here that we want to try and steer clear of, if at all possible. So to try and get beyond this, I mean, it seems like a bit of a contradiction in terms of how you're going to elect a president versus the judges and being concerned, but by the same end, what they had is this representation. They don't want a king, God, no, absolutely not for the executive branch. But they don't want, by the same end, here in terms of the judicial branch, that these federal judges are all going to be simply mere pawns of the chief executive, of the executive branch, because that's going to further empower the executive branch. So how to work around this? This became here, in essence, a major question, a major issue. Well, for the judicial branch, all of the delegates here in Philadelphia, they could all agree. They could all agree here that what you had, first and foremost, is that the federal courts had to be superior to the state courts. So if the state courts say it's A and it goes up to the next lowest level of federal courts, and the federal courts say, no, it's B, you lose. Or they could send it back here to the state courts, maybe have someone else look at it, etc. So ultimate jurisdiction here would rest with the federal courts. Well, no surprise there. Just like the government itself, you're going to have this legislative assembly, national legislative assembly superior to a state legislative assembly from South Carolina or Connecticut or Rhode Island or whatever would be the case. So they have that squared away. But by the same end, here, what they envision is levels of federal courts. Levels here of federal courts to varying degrees. And in this sense, the focus would be to give these courts not just power over the state courts, but also here the judicial courts would have a say in terms of the executive branch, would have a say in terms of the legislative branch. And this would go all the way up here, these federal courts, to a supreme tribunal, what eventually becomes known as the Supreme Court. And the question became one, what do we do with this? What do we do here with the Supreme Tribunal? Well, we can appoint here, we can have the president formally appoint members of the Supreme Tribunal. They're all overwhelmingly be coming from the federal courts. It's kind of like a step up, a step up, a step up, a step up. Now you are on the Supreme Tribunal. Or if you were in the Supreme Court, there's no way you're going to be allowing here for individuals in the House of Representatives to be here appointed for life. There's no way you're going to have here individual chief executive. It's already at. So you can only run for a 4-year term. Who wants to run for a second 4-year term? That's fine. No issues there whatsoever. But you can only serve one 4-year term here, and then you have to run for re-election. So you're not going to be appointed for life. God, no. Absolutely not. So you have this, but to further empower here the Supreme Tribunal, you are going to become a Supreme Court justice for life. For life. Well, at this time, life expectancy here wasn't all that high. Wasn't all that high. I can even go a century forward to 1880. Life expectancy in the United States in 1880 was 48 years. So you have here a sense that even if you're appointed for life, you're most likely not going to be serving a couple of years. Time's not on your side by any stretch of the imagination. So an exception is going to be made in this regard. The other question came up, well, okay, so we've got 2 senators. We're going to have 65 members here in the House of Representatives. We'll have 1 chief executive from the sound of things. How many Supreme Court justices? Well, they don't answer that question. Okay? So there's nothing in the Supreme Court, nothing here in the Constitution saying how many Supreme Court justices you can have. You could have 9. Sometimes, for the most part, you have 9. Sometimes there have been 13, 6. You could have 47. You could have 112 if you want. There's nothing in the Constitution that said this. So for the most part here, in terms of the court, it's going to be viewed as above it all. But it is going to be interpreting the Constitution, and it's something that's necessary, obviously, as the years progress, because they know the nation is going to be changing, hopefully growing, hopefully prosperous. But here, you want this flexibility to change things as well. But you want to here be sure that you have the judicial branch has some power as well. These federal courts especially, also the final say, ultimately the Supreme Tribunal or Supreme Court. The three branches, therefore, are pretty well set. They're pretty well set, at least foundationally, here in the summer of 1787. But what's happening is there's a lot of debate and bickering going on and so forth, and alternative plans are also going to come to the floor. Alternative plans will come to the floor. And with this first alternative plan, it was called the New Jersey plan. So you've got the Virginia plan with some add-ons. Now you have this New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan here stressed the following. Number one, you're going to have one parliament, and one parliament only, Congress. Not two entities, not a representative house and a Senate house. You're going to have just one. And each state, as far as New Jersey was concerned, each state gets one vote in this Congress. You're going to have a total of 13 votes. That's it. One person, one representing each state. Number two, this chief executive, the chief executive is to be elected by Congress, and by the same end can serve just one term, one 4-year term, that's it. And this chief executive can be removed from office if the majority of the state governors decide he should be removed. Decide here he should in fact be removed. Number three, all federal judges, not just the Supreme Tribunal, but all federal judges are to serve for life. They are to serve for life, and they are to be appointed here exclusively by the chief executive. Well, the New Jersey plan was kind of controversial, putting it mildly. Alexander Hamilton, prominent member here of the United States government, also prominent as the member here of the state of New York at the Constitutional Convention. What Hamilton did is he got a little bit fed up with all the bickering going on and each state grandstanding and posturing, especially the smaller states, when it just needed to move forward. So what Hamilton comes up with here, what he comes up with at the end of summer of 1787, is what he himself refers to as the Hamilton Plan. And what his intent was here was to make a mockery out of all these plans and all this thing basically being dragged out and dragged out and dragged out. The Virginia plan is fine. Let's move with it. Let's get this Constitution up and off the ground and call it a day. The Hamilton plan stresses in a similar fashion to his frustration as was coming forth. Number one, this is going to be very similar, the American Parliament to the British Parliament. We're going to have a lower house, we're going to have an upper house, elected to 3-year terms. Number two, members of the Senate have, as an opportunity, the ability to serve for life if they so chose. The executive branch will have here this chief executive or president who is going to be chosen here as well by this lower house of Congress and is also going to be serving for life. The judicial branch, the executive branch is also going to have absolute veto power over all bills. So if this chief executive who's serving for life doesn't like what he's seeing, he can veto it. And that's it. No more. The judicial branch here would be appointed as well by Congress, and would also be set up to serve for life. What you have here is a situation is that Hamilton wants to bring his plan to the floor for vote because he knows there's no way in hell it's going to pass. They don't even vote on it. He's fine with that. What he wanted to do here was to recognize the fact of needing to move forward. By the same end, the New Jersey plan will be voted on. It will be voted on, but it will be defeated. It will be defeated by 7-3 in terms of the respective states voting for it. As time moves on, the smaller states become all the more concerned, all the more disillusioned that they're going to be dominated in this new federal government by the 3 big states. And you have here individuals who are going to speak out. Gunning Bedford Jr., who is a delegate from Delaware, stated the following, and it was an open threat to the larger states across the Constitutional Convention, and I quote, "The small states will find at some point or another a foreign European ally of more honor and good faith who will take us by the hand and lead us smaller states all to justice." A little bit of tension here as time in fact moves on. Well, what you have by the time we get to September of 1787 Because all sorts of revisions, all sorts of speeches had taken place, etc. And you have here some of the delegates really dominated in terms of having the floor and talking about what the nation should be, where it should be headed, etc. But you have here, for example, James Madison would give a total of 161 speeches here in Philadelphia during this convention from May into September. James Wilson, who we talked about, he was prominent with the executive branch, also from the state of Virginia. James Wilson gave 168 speeches of all here, making him the second most individuals here at the convention to come forth with plans or ideas or whatever the case would be. But the grand champion of all here was Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris. And Gouverneur Morris was a delegate. He was a delegate from the state of Pennsylvania. And Gouverneur Morris is somebody who is a very interesting individual. He was somebody who believed firmly that we've got to pull all of this together and that we have to see ourselves as one nation, not as 13 distinct states. That we have to have the strong centralized government. And it is an absolute necessity to come forth from this convention with this effectively intact. He's a resident of the city of New York. He's best known here for establishing the grid system across Manhattan, developing 17 different avenues, a total of 155 seats, really helped build the infrastructure of New York City, late 1700s, early 1800s. Theodore Roosevelt, eventual Republican president of the United States, this was one of his great heroes. He wrote here a biography of the life and times of Gouverneur Morris and the impact he had on New York City, as well as the United States when it was in formally its infancy. Well, what he's going to come forth with here is Gouverneur Morris, who at the convention had given all of these speeches. He had been heavily involved in the revisions, going back and forth, trying to help here the smaller states, because he could also stress, I'm from a small state. New York at this time was one of those 10 small states. To try and bridge here the gap, worked effectively, worked effortlessly along this road. He would be given here by the delegates a way as the Constitution is setting forth, is coming into play effectively, more and more, the preamble to the Constitution needed to be effectively written. And in this sense, Gouverneur Morris will be asked, since he had done most of the speeches and a great deal of the legwork, was so heavily involved, so too was James Madison, no doubt, if he would write, in essence, this introduction. Okay? The introduction. So like, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson is writing the introduction, July 4th, 1776. Then he goes into the reasons. So it's very, very common at this time. So now you've got this foundation of this federal government, this central government, but you need an introduction to it. Well, what he did, Gouverneur Morris, as he sat down and he wrote his opening salvo, was as follows. We the people of New Hampshire, South Carolina, Georgia, Connecticut, Rhode Island, so on and so forth. And I was like, no. That's what that's doing, is it's recognizing here these independent states as opposed to one nation. This could be viewed as like 13 distinct nations, which is exactly what a lot of the smaller states are seeing this as. So he starts over. And he will author here this preamble to the Constitution. We the people of the United States. So we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, here support the general welfare, to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. So he goes in here in terms of the detail of this preamble, and as far as the delegates are concerned, okay, this is perfect. This is perfect for wrapping things up in this sense. Well, Ben Franklin would state here, as a delegate of Pennsylvania, that the Constitution is far from perfect. It is far from perfect. There is no doubt about that. But what we have here is a working model that we've also set the stage, and all the delegates have agreed, that in the future, if we want changes or amendments, they can be added. Because what Franklin envisioned here is this new nation, the United States, was going to get larger as the 1800s progressed. Little did he know that it has become a massive nation, one of the largest on the planet in the present day. But it's going to get larger. Times change. Most likely, Franklin saw the northeastern part of the new nation, the United States, following a path comparable to that of Great Britain or France, with this Industrial Revolution, which began, of course, in Britain in 1760. It was making Britain here rapidly the most wealthy nation on all of planet Earth, or even wealthier than it had been before. He sees that France following a similar path. The United States should as well. The U.S. should also get involved in this as well, if possible. So he recognizes the fact that what you have here are changes are on the horizon. And if we have these changes on the horizon, this Constitution also has to reflect the ability to change with the times, to change here formally with the times. So in this sense, for Ben Franklin, you've got the preamble done. You have here these articles. The articles in the Constitution, what they're going to do is they're going to spell out in detail what the jobs and responsibilities are of the legislative branch, as well as the executive branch, as well as the judicial branch. You have this system of checks and balances, because it is absolutely imperative that not one of these three branches here oversee or push on the others and emerges as the dominant force, because it will be a very, very dangerous situation. And as I referenced before, I'll reference again, the greatest concern for the Founding Fathers was the executive branch, because it was most likely here to be corrupted. What you have here is a sense that as far as James Madison is concerned, all things considered here, this is as close as we could get, as good as we can get for now. It's imperfect. Ben Franklin would stress the same thing. This document's imperfect, but it's a significant start. And it's flexible enough, this living and breathing document, that hopefully, with amendments added, it can change. It will be formally able to change here with the time. On September 17, 1787, the Constitution here would be formally signed. And the Constitutional Convention would now formally wrap up. It would come to an end. Well, what this meant is that just because you have this document, this Constitution, system of checks and balances, the three branches, etc., just because you have it doesn't mean that it's official. Because now it has to go to the state legislatures in all 13 states. Rhode Island, remember, they weren't even there. So it's got to go to the state legislatures to be, in fact, formally ratified. And here, with the 41 delegates who were still there, 38 of them, not 41, but 38 of them would end up signing it. The other three had major issues still with the Constitution. Well, to get this ratified, you need 9 of 13 states. And the issues are coming back almost immediately from these state legislatures. And the issues that are coming back, especially, one of the biggest of all was Massachusetts. And the issues here that Massachusetts had is that they wanted more insurance policies. They wanted more care to be taken. We need amendments. We've signed off on this. Yes, fire. That's great. That's fine. But we need here amendments put before we are actually going to approve this. From James Madison's perspective, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The Constitution is fine the way it is. Well, it comes back here from other state legislatures that unless we get here a Bill of Rights, unless we get a full 10 amendments, we're not signing. We're not going to ratify this. And you need 9 states to ratify this. So James Madison realizes he has no choice. He has no choice. He promises a Bill of Rights will be added, that a Bill of Rights here will be added. But you need to sign this document. We need to ratify it. We need to get it off the ground effective immediately. On December 7th, 1787, Delaware became the first of 13 states to effectively sign the U.S. Constitution. Followed then in rapid succession by Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. In February of 1788, Massachusetts would ratify this Constitution on the basis here that the Bill of Rights is forthcoming. 10 amendments right out of the gate are demanded. Maryland, South Carolina would follow suit. New Hampshire, on June 21st, 1788, made it official. And what you have here is you've got your 9 states. The federal government under the United States Constitution would effectively begin working on March 4th, 1789. From a standpoint of the 10 amendments, it is something here that James Madison is going to be forced to add. He did not want to add them. He believed it could add here to more problems as the centuries, in fact, formally progressed for the United States, as opposed to making things easier. But he realized that he had no choice. Therefore, he will follow through on his promise to add these 10 amendments, these Bill of Rights, which would then also have to be ratified as well to be added to the Constitution. Some of the more prominent: the first Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right of people to peacefully assemble. We'll be tied in on that. The United States was a Protestant nation for Protestant people exclusively, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants across the board. Catholics, if you're a Catholic here in colonial America, you are second class, clearly. You were forced to live in the colony of Maryland, or the state of Maryland, which is where all the Catholics lived. But they're a very small population, 3% of the population overall. Jews in America were even a smaller population here, about 1/5 the size of the Catholic population in this nation. Well, you're going to etch in stone in terms of this Bill of Rights that all American citizens have these rights: freedom of speech, press, religion, the right of people to peacefully assemble. Second major Bill of Rights: a well-regulated militia, the right to bear arms. In the present day in the United States, you have at least 400 million guns, and you have 340 million people. Some estimates go higher to 500 million guns. And you have here, in terms of the death toll, one of the highest on the entire planet. And in this situation, it's a constitutional right. It's in the Bill of Rights, absolutely. At the time it was written here and added by James Madison, under pressure coming from Massachusetts, the concern on the part of the smaller states is that we still don't trust those larger states. And if these larger states here are going to start pushing us around, we want to keep our guns. We want the right to bear arms, to protect here South Carolina from Pennsylvania or from Virginia or whoever. So in this situation here, you have this constitutional right, part of the Bill of Rights. Number 2, the right to bear arms. Other prominent ones: number 5, you cannot be tried for the same offense in this nation twice. Okay. Number 6, criminal prosecutions: the accused has a right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. Okay. Also added as part of the Bill of Rights. Number 8, excessive bail shall not be required for anyone arrested, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And Part 10, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So in this sense, and as we're going to be moving on here, wrapping up today, what you have is a sense that to get a constitutional amendment is very, very difficult. As I may have referenced in our opening salvo, you have had proposals of 11,470 amendments since 1791. Of those 11,740 amendments, only 17 have made it. Just 17. Those first 10, we've got a total of 27 amendments. The first 10, that's the Bill of Rights, right out of the gate, 1791. And they were necessary to act in good faith as far as Madison was concerned, by the same end to make sure everybody was on board, not as suspicious or not didn't feel as threatened. Hence, in terms of the right to bear arms, from the time of that, where it was written, it was a legitimate fear on the part of the smaller states, and understandably so. But you have here this living, breathing document that if alterations are necessary, they will in fact be made. But when you have a track record from this time onwards of just 17 new amendments and nearly 12,000 proposed amendments, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very, very difficult to see this through, and perhaps this is what the founding fathers were in fact actually after right out of the get-go. When all is said and done, the nation itself, the United States, would now start with this central government. George Washington is going to be elected President of the United States, the first president of all. He will run unopposed here, serving a 4-year term, his first 4-year term. And with these individuals, recognizing this as an imperfect document, which it is, but a flexible document, a living document nevertheless, if they would have been able to foresee the future of this nation as it continues here to formally grow and prosper over the course of the 19th century and the 20th century, they would be nothing short of amazed. In this journey of life, we have good times, we have bad times. This is also the case for nations. Going forward here for the United States, as the nation here is going to grow by leaps and bounds, more constitutional amendments will be added, and we're going to look at them over the course here of the 19th century and into the 20th century of some of the most prominent of all, and the impact that this would have across here this nation of the U.S., this federal republican experiment. This experiment here gets off the ground. What the future would hold, wasn't entirely clear. But for all intents and purposes, over the course of now nearly 250 years, is pretty impressive when all was said and done. Thank you so very much. Thank you. So we've set the foundation of the Constitution, and what we're going to do in our 3 lectures that follow is we're going to look at it in action. Okay? Look at it in action and tweaks that need to be made, Supreme Court decisions that are made, the impact that the American Civil War has. We're going to be adding 3 constitutional amendments after the Civil War ends in 1865, the impact of the women's rights movement, the impact here of prohibition, that noble experiment as was referred to as, and bringing things as well into not just the present day, but projecting onwards as well into the future. Any questions? Okay, if you have any questions, swing on up. Otherwise, wonderful to see you, and I look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Take care, be well.